Webster defines crunch time as a critical moment or period, like the end of a game, when decisive action is needed. Every sports fan knows this time in the game. Your palms sweat just a little more, your heart races just a little bit faster, and you live and die with every play until the final seconds tick off the clock and you're either celebrating a victory or disappointed by the defeat. The team at Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network understands just how critical these moments are. For us, it begins as soon as the next set of games are on the board. We evaluate the opening lines and any breaking news throughout the week. We cover each game inside and out, whether it's from inside the locker room to a huddle down on the field, the court, or the ice. We take you inside the meeting room with scouts, coaches, and executives. We have our fingers on the pulse of all the sports that we cover: the National Hockey League, NBA, college basketball, college football, and the National Football League. We are the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, and we're here to help you find your sports advantage. After all the data has been crunched, we then turn it over to Kenneth for the best analysis around. His unique perspective in both understanding the data and how it applies to the game and how you win is the Crunch Time Sports Advantage. Are you ready? The Crunch Time Jet is fueled and ready for takeoff, and the Crunch Time Express is about to leave the station. Your VIP pass has been approved, so all aboard.
Welcome to the 2024 College Football Team Autopsy Report. An autopsy report is a document that summarizes the findings of an autopsy, an examination of a body after death. It includes details of the examination, tests, and observations performed, as well as the cause and manner of death. Just like a real autopsy report, the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network College Football Autopsy Report examines a team's body of work after the season has concluded. This report includes a review of the team's season win total and whether they met expectations, key offensive, defensive, and special teams metrics that shaped the season, a deep dive into coaching decisions, including situational play and fourth down aggressiveness, a final season grade, evaluating execution, performance in key moments, and consistency, the final verdict, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what must be fixed for 2025. With the 2024 season in the rearview mirror, it's time to examine the patient. To present the findings, we have called in our Chief Medical Examiner and Senior Analyst, Kenneth.
And welcome back into the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network's 2024 Team Autopsy Report. Folks, we got the Syracuse Orange on the autopsy table this morning. And this is a team that I was intrigued by all year long. Started with the hire of former assistant coach there at the University of Georgia in Fran Brown. Folks, this guy is the right leader for this program, and we saw that in his very first year as the head coach there in Syracuse, New York. So let's put this patient on the table and let's see if we can do a deep dive into how well this team performed and where some of the challenges that will be there for them in 2025. And we're going to always start there. And if this is your first time with us, thank you for joining us, whether it's on our YouTube channel or on our Twitter feed at Crunch Time VIP. If you're listening on a podcast, thank you as well. Don't worry, any data that I will refer to on the screen, I got you covered here. Okay, so back in June, this team had a season win total of 7.5. Now, getting to that 9-win plateau in the regular season, absolutely easy surpassed that preseason win total. When we look at our in-season composite win total, basically there are 3 significant categories that we look at to build out that number. We actually had the Orange at a 7-win plateau there. So this team still surpassed both of those win totals, but we want to do a deeper dive and see if we can't discover how they got those 2 additional wins that we weren't forecasting, and where are going to be some of the challenges. So let's go ahead and move forward. and talk about two very unique numbers, but very critical to understanding these teams. And we'll start there with the strength of schedule. Now, your strength of schedule, for the most part, you can't control, but the part that you absolutely can control is who do you schedule in the non-conference? Are you loading up a bunch of group of 6 and FCS opponents, or are you really testing yourself in the non-conference? And if we look at where Syracuse was last year at a .407, that is the 57th toughest schedule out of 134 Division I teams last year. So a fairly solid schedule. And once we kind of start picking apart what their opponents' records were on their schedule, we'll really kind of see how difficult that number was. Now, your strength of record, you absolutely have no control over this. Once the season is underway, how do your opponents perform week in and week out? In Syracuse, SOR, or strength of record, was a .599. Now, that's 23rd in Division I college football last year. So they scheduled a challenging schedule, but their opponents week in and week out were putting up a lot of wins during the regular season. So let's go ahead and get to that data point. And as I referenced, just looking at their strength of record, and if you're watching on the screen, I'm going to go through those numbers for those of you listening on the podcast. I'll give you that data here as well. So let's take a look at Syracuse's opponents. Ohio Bobcats went 9-3 last year, played for the MAC championship. Georgia Tech was 7-5. Stanford, now an in-conference opponent, really struggled last year, 3-9. Holy Cross. Then UNLV played for the Mountain West Championship, finished 10-2. NC State was 6-6. Pitt was 7-5. Virginia Tech was 6-6. Boston College was 7-5. Cal, just coming over from the defunct Pac-12, was 6-6. Connecticut was 8-4. And then, of course, Miami, 10-2. So outside of Stanford, all of their opponents at least finished the regular season 500 or better. And that's how you get that really good strength of record percentage there. Now, how good were the defenses that Syracuse went up against last year? And we use a baseline of 68 because that's how many Power 4 teams we had last year with the 4 major conferences in Notre Dame. How many of those opponents were inside of that top 68 number? Ohio was 57th. Georgia Tech was 15th. UNLV was 62nd. Pitt was 56th. Virginia Tech was 28. Boston College, 55. Cal was 46. And then finishing out the year with Miami at 47. So 8 of their 12 regular season opponents were inside of that top 68. However, only 1 inside of that top 25. Now, if you look at an average of where those defenses power ranked, 57th, you're looking at a team that would probably be about 7-5 based on just their defensive performance. So a really solid schedule week in and week out. But then again, like I said, not that upper tier schedule that really would have boosted their profile at the end of the year. Now, let's dig into how this team looked from where the NCAA average was last year. Their accounting stats, and what we call accounting stats, is basically anything you're going to find on a reference website. And then we're going to give you their data points based on adjusted for opponent. So let's start there with scoring. Last year, the average team averaged about 28 points per game. Syracuse averaged 32.6 points per game in the regular season, and when we adjust that for opponent, actually goes up almost a point to 33.4. The average team last year threw the ball for about 227 yards per game. Syracuse, one of the most pass-happy offenses in college football last year, 361 yards per game. But when we adjust that for opponent, goes down just a little bit to 351, but still significantly over the NCAA average there. Now, the run game, they really struggled to run the ball last year. Average team was about 160 yards per game. Syracuse was at 93 yards per game, but when we adjust that for opponent, actually goes up about 30 yards to 123. Still well below the NCAA average, but not as bad as their stats will look on paper. Average team had about 387 yards per game in total offense. Syracuse 456. When we adjust that for opponent, goes up to 475 yards per game. So this team was able to put up both points and yards on the board last year. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper into the numbers here. Last season, a team averaged a score, whether it was a touchdown or field goal, on about 40% of their drives, 39.8. Syracuse, over 55% of their drives last year ended with either a touchdown or a field goal. That is absolutely impressive. Now, when we look at just their drives ending with a touchdown, so not just kicking field goals, but how many times were you able to put 6 on the board instead of 3? Average team last year was about 29%. Syracuse was at 42.8%. Again, absolutely phenomenal. And third down conversion, average team last year was about 39% on third downs. Syracuse, a whopping 54.2%. Extremely impressive. This team also did a solid job of protecting their quarterback, Cal McCord, the transfer quarterback from Ohio State last year. Gave up only 21 sacks last year and did a good job of taking care of the ball. Just 15 turnovers in the regular season last year. So again, impressive. Now, let's go to our 3 E's. How effective, how explosive, and how efficient was this Syracuse offense last year? 28th most effective offense last year. 41st in explosive plays, and then 15th in efficiency. Syracuse ended the regular season last year for us as the 26th rated offense in college football last year. Absolutely phenomenal there on offense. Let's take a look at the defense and see what kind of caliber offenses that they went up against last year. And we'll get into their accounting and adjusted stats here in just a moment. So, once again, going to use that baseline of 68. How many of those teams that they went against last year was inside of that top 68? Georgia Tech was 61st. UNLV 32nd. NC State was 43rd. Pitt was 65th. Virginia Tech was 34th. Boston College 54th. And then Miami was our number 1 power ranked offense last year in college football. So 7 of their opponents were inside of that top 68. Again, only one of those opponents was inside of the top 25. So average out for their opponents last year about 57 power ranking. Again, that would probably put this offense around a 6-6, 7-5 mark there. So you face quality defenses. You just didn't face the extremes. You didn't face a lot of elite defenses. You also didn't face a lot of defenses that were ranked outside of the top 100. Matter of fact, none of their opponents' offenses last year were outside of the top 100. I mentioned back in the opener that the Syracuse Orange won 2 games over our composite win total expectation. If I'm looking here at their schedule, I can probably point to the 2 games that I thought that easily could have gone the other way. Now, credit this team. They won those games, but when we're just looking at it from a data standpoint, the game against UNLV midway through the season, winning that game 44-41, easily could have gone the other way. And then, of course, the finale there against Miami. Miami really failed to take advantage of an opportunity that would have gotten them possibly to the ACC title game and potentially into the college football playoffs, as we saw how that played out with SMU. So those would probably be the two games from just a data standpoint that I would be looking at to say those are the games that really help flip this team over that season win total. So even if they would have lost one of those games, you still got to the pay window there with Syracuse. Now let's take a look at that defense. Just going to go through their accounting stats here and the adjusted numbers here. Defense gave up 28.7 points per game. So for a defensive-minded head coach, you're definitely going to want to see that number improve in 2025. When we adjust for opponent, it goes down about 4 points to 25 points per game. So that puts you in line with the NCAA average there. As far as their pass defense per game, 216 yards per game. When we adjust for opponents, virtually identical, 216.4. So no significant change there in the data. Same can be said for their rush defense. 153.7 yards per game allowed. When we adjust for opponent, 157.2. So no major significant differences there when we adjust for opponent. And then finally, total offense allowed, basically right there in line with the NCAA average of 370. When we adjust for opponent, just goes up slightly to 373.6. So this defense, whether we're looking at their raw accounting numbers or our adjusted data, this team defense was about what we saw week in and week out. Let's take a look at some of their advanced data. We talked about their the scoring drive allowed percentage. How many of their opponents' drive ended with a touchdown or field goal? 43%. A little bit worse than the NCAA average there. As far as their opponents' drives ending with a touchdown last year, about, let's call it 30%, just a tick above what the NCAA average was. They were a little bit better than the NCAA average as far as getting off the field on third downs. Their opponents converting about 36%, almost a full 3 percentage points better than the NCAA average. This team did an okay job of getting after the quarterback, 21 sacks last year. NCAA average about 23.5 for the season last year. So a decent job of getting after the quarterback. Nothing spectacular there. Opponents converted 8 out of 11 fourth down attempts last year, good for almost 73%. That is significantly higher than the NCAA average of about 53%. Did not do a great job of forcing turnovers either. Only 14 forced turnovers last year. Now, let's take a look at the 3 E's. From a defensive standpoint, this team was 85th in all 3 categories: effective defense, giving up explosive plays, and efficiency. You don't want to be in the 80s from a defensive standpoint. This team finished as our 86th rated defense overall last year in college football. So if I had to bullet point both their offense and defense, I would say explosive passing game with efficiency on offense. I would also look at struggled in very key situations there from the defensive side of the ball. Now, let's take a look at their coaching and situational play. This team was a -1 in the turnover differential. That ranks you about 69th last year. 7.2 penalties per game. Want to see that come down at least a full penalty per game, because the average last year is about 62. So that's something that Coach Brown is definitely going to have to work on. In one-score games, this team was absolutely phenomenal, going 6-2 in one-score games, and then finishing a perfect 4-0 against quality opponents. Brian Brown last year was one of the most aggressive head coaches going for it on fourth down. 25 attempts, 17 conversions. So good job there, converting at about a 68% clip. He was ranked 9th out of 144 qualifying head coaches last year in going for it on fourth down. We talked about the special teams. 18 attempts, 13 conversions by their field goal unit. So a little bit below average there. Converted 44 out of 45 extra point attempts. Punting game was about average, 42.2 yards per punt. That puts you about in the middle of the pack in college football. Matter of fact, just a little bit below. So if I had to talk about the special teams, I would say average performance at best there. So let's get into how this offense looked when they won versus how they looked when they lost. In their 9 wins last year in the regular season, 35.9 points per game, throwing the ball about 46 attempts per game last year for 367 yards, 8.1 yards per attempt, 12 yards per completion. Those are very, very solid numbers there from their passing game last year. Ran the ball with some success last year in their wins. 34 rushing attempts for 116 yards, 3.4 yards per rushing attempt. Again, solid, not great. You want to see that rushing yards per rushing attempt in college football to be at least 4.5, if not even a little bit better. So the run game is definitely going to be something that this team needs to improve on. I will talk about that more here in just a moment. This team, when they won last year, averaged 4.4 touchdowns per game, committed less than a turnover per game last year, and they had some semblance of a run-pass ratio balance, about 57% pass to 43% run there. Did a good job of converting on third downs as well, 54% on third downs. Only committed 7 turnovers in those 9 wins. Now, in their 3 losses, points per game take a significant dip down to 22.7 points per game. The passing attempts go up to 51 attempts per game, but the yardage goes down to 351 yards per game, 6.8 yards per passing attempt, 11.3 yards per completion. But here's the biggest indicator. And folks, I had to look at these numbers twice to make sure I had them correct. You're looking at a team that ran the ball about 24 times per game last year when they lost, for 24 yards per game. That's right, 1 yard per rushing attempt last year when they lost. When this team was losing, they were throwing the ball a lot more attempts and definitely could not have any balance whatsoever. You're looking at a run-pass split of 68% pass to 32% run. Struggled on third down conversions, only 35%, and they committed 8 total turnovers in those 3 losses. So the difference when this team won versus when they lost, you're talking about 13 more points per game, about 6 less passing attempts per game last year, but for 16 more yards per game. But the run game is really where this team struggled. 10 more rushing attempts per game and 92 more yards per game. That is a major swing. So if you want to beat Syracuse last year, what you had to do was you had to get them behind in the scoreboard and they would completely abandon the run game. So that's something to keep an eye on for 2025. Now let's take a look at the defense here. In those 9 victories, this defense was giving up 26.7 points per game. Opponent was throwing for about 245 yards on 32 passing attempts, 7.6 yards per attempt, 11.6 yards per completion. Very solid there from their pass defense. The rushing defense, 28 rushing attempts by their opponents for about 143 yards rushing, 5.1 yards per rushing attempt. As I mentioned, You want to be around that 5 number for offense. You don't want to be that number on defense. Their opponents were about as balanced as you're going to get. 53% pass, 47% run, 42% on third downs when they won were their opponents. And this defense forced 11 turnovers in those wins. In those 3 losses, defense was giving up 35 points per game, only 129 yards per game passing on 24 attempts. And the reason why their opponents were finding great success on the ground. 35 rushing attempts per game for 186 yards per game. Still 5.3 yards per rushing attempt. It was just a volume there. And this team in those 3 losses only forced a total of 3 turnovers. So the difference between when this team lost last year and when they won on the defensive side of the ball, they were giving up 8 more points per game, giving up about 116 yards per game passing and another 43 on defense. So defense struggled significantly in those losses, but the offense really did not help them out with the volume of turnovers that they committed in those 3 losses. So let's get to what went wrong for the Syracuse Orangemen, and we'll get to that in the final grade. The Syracuse Orangemen will get a final grade of a B+ last year. We talked about it. What went wrong? Lack of a consistent running game, struggled on 4th down, and poor execution in high-scoring games. The final verdict: Syracuse had a strong season last year, exceeding expectations due to their efficient passing attack and clutch performance in close games. However, their defensive inconsistencies and lack of a strong rushing attack prevented them from reaching elite level. So I'm going to go back to their strengths and weaknesses really quickly, and then I'll get to their 3 keys for 2025. Strong passing attack led by Kyle McCord, who's now in the NFL last year, completed 66% of his passes for almost 4,800 yards passing, 34 touchdowns, 12 INTs. When this team struggled, this team was turning the ball over, and we saw that play out on a couple of different stages last year. The game against Pitt was a defensive masterpiece by the Pitt Panthers. Their strengths on offenses: strong passing game, 3rd down success, good coaching decision on 4th down. As I mentioned, the weaknesses: poor rushing game, defensive struggles there on 4th down, and lack of playmakers. So what does this team need to improve on in 2025? First and foremost, must improve the rushing consistency. You can't have a anemic running game when you play against some of those teams that you're going to play against in the ACC. Key number 2, must strengthen the defensive play on 4th down. You do that by getting teams into 3rd and longer situations there, really taking away that element of going for it on 4th down. And then finally, reduce the reliance on the passing game. With a new quarterback coming in, doesn't have the experience that Kyle McCord had when he transferred from Ohio State last year. You're going to have much more balance there from your offense. If the Syracuse Orange can focus on those 3 keys, they can take a step forward and possibly compete for a conference championship in the Atlantic Coast Conference in 2025.
Thank you for tuning into this podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and our deep dive into all things college football. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You can follow us on Twitter at CrunchTimeVIP for updates, insights, and more content. And make sure to visit our website at crunchtimesportsadvantage.com for in-depth blogs, game previews, and information about our Crunch Time Express handicapping packages. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for our next patient on the 2024 College Football Autopsy.